Welcome to Mr. Gunn's advice on how to pass a Unit 2 examination in philosophy, looking at mind and body and trying to break down the question and give some recommendations for tactics, skills and what you need to know. I'm going to start with the basics. The first thing you can see is that you're looking at an example question and that you would have 1 hour and 15 minutes to answer this one question. I'm now going to give you a breakdown of what sorts of skills and aptitudes would be desirable for this particular type of question in Unit 2. The first thing you'll be needing is knowledge and understanding. This is of key concepts, terminology within the topic area, and the ability to use the knowledge you have in a fluent and controlled manner. The second most important thing you'll need to do is produce a well-selected range of material. This is in the specific criteria just here. Select, and also in the recommendations provided by Laura Mears in How to Get an A in Excel AS Philosophy. And the idea is that the factual knowledge you provide will be well selected to support the features of the topic you're investigating and analyse issues raised by the topic. And we have found from experience that a wide range of selected materials perhaps something that the examiner is prioritising more than depth. So rather than explaining everything you know about every individual scholar you mention one at a time in a linear fashion, instead you should focus on being extremely wide-ranging and selecting your material appropriately. You will need to include key thinkers and quotations, and in this discussion I'll be outlining which of those are most important. Remember, whenever we use a quotation, we should be applying the quotation to the context of the essay and examining it as though we were removing a jewel from a ring, holding it up and looking at it from a different angle. It will be important that you use alternative views in your essay, that is, to contrast the dominant view on the issue. So if we're looking at mind and body, it might be that you step into different types of monism and dualism, rather than just focusing on the most prominent ideas within the fields. During your essay, you must, of course, clearly express your own point of view, and in a well-constructed essay, this point of view will be built through the essay, and the conclusion will be an appropriate description of the views and arguments you've outlined throughout. Even though your argument, your essay will show balance, you should still be able to build a consistent argument that runs through your essay like a thread. Some desirable skills that you may have as well include an awareness of the context of the arguments that you're presenting. So when you pitch an idea, say, for example, this view was rising to prominence due to an increasing amount of authority given by intellectuals to science. That sort of context can really add to the dynamism of your essay. And finally, where possible, relate your essay to wider issues within the world. If you're aware of new developments being made, for example, then you can mention those as well. The one area that I think, from experience, we should focus on, and I think I've emphasised it already, but the main area that I want us to look at is the wide range of selected material. And I'm going to be uploading more resources to focus on and help you improve your wide range as the year goes on. All right, let's start by looking at key terms that may help you analyse this question, will help you construct your own individual response to this question. We are basically physical beings, which represents a fairly traditional, typical or desirable essay question from mind and body. I'm going to construct a list of key terms, and I want you to think through the meaning of these key terms and become aware of areas where you may need to brush up in your revision. This represents quite a reasonable list of initial key terms. We have dualism, monism, which if we had to pick two, let's face it, they would be top of our list. Consciousness, physicalist or physicalism, epiphenomenalism. If you want to know more about epiphenomenalism, then be sure to look at the video that I'll be putting up soon on Frank Jackson, where he talks about what Mary didn't know, and that is our best starting point for epiphenomenalism. Behaviourism, again, I'll be producing some resources for you that should help us on that. Parallelism and occasionalism. In your revision, you should also aim to include contrasting views and be sure that you've covered separate areas. This year we're going to try and increase our religious input, for example, into this topic area and into our range of study. Some key ideas you might consider then to be sure that you're dealing with a contrasting set of views include Western religious views, and these may come from a wide field, but we might examine Christian views primarily there. Eastern religious views, where we'll look at Buddhist and Hindu ideas, the Atman, for example, from Hinduism, and the Anatta idea and concept from Buddhism will be useful to us. Also, we must have different understandings of how different individuals may interpret terms such as soul and personal identity. Laura Mears recommends that in your revision as well you consider creating pages specifically about key scholars associated with the subject area of mind, body and soul. And whilst you construct these, you must also continually think about your own opinion and how you would reflect on the issue, what is your standpoint, and rate these contributions according to your own personal opinion. And here is a list that is not all-inclusive, but does identify those that I'd argue are the main scholars for our revision for this topic: Aristotle, Plato, Kant, Ryle, Dawkins, Nagel, Frank Jackson, and René Descartes. Now I'm going to try and give you a question breakdown. So we're looking specifically at this question here. We are basically physical beings, and Laura Mears categorises this for us under the following heading. I think it's really useful to look at the wording here. She would categorise this particular question under the heading, mind and body are the same thing or different, or there is a range of possibilities for explaining the mind and body relationship. Essentially, you're being asked to examine a wide range of explanations for whether or not we ought to be monist, materialist, explain the world and human beings as though they are one, or that there is a wider range. And so this is an open invitation to use quite a wide range of material. In this particular question, I think it would be a favourable question. Laura Mears explains that this is quite a popular question, having been asked, students were asked to answer this question in June 2010, 2011, twice in 2012, and in 2013. In order to be successful on this particular question, it's clear that historical and cultural context will be very important. You might want to think about, for example, whether the thinkers are pre- or post-Enlightenment, and how that may link to religious arguments concerning life after death and the mind and body relationship. Scholars mentioned by Mears as useful with this range of question is really wide-ranging, and the skill will be to select the similarities and differences between explaining the mind and body relationship between Dawkins, Descartes, Plato, Aristotle, Ryle, and some others you may consider include Frank Jackson, Carnap, and more recently John Searle with his biological naturalistic explanation. I think it will be important to structure our revision around different types of exam questions, and I'm going to look at the second main group of exam questions identified by Laura Mears now. A less popular question, but an important one to prepare for, especially seeing as we don't know exactly what's going to come up. This question has been asked in at least 2009 and 2010, this type of question which focuses around the idea that there will be a statement that suggests or implies that we will never be able to understand the relationship between mind and body, or questions whether or not the issue is resolvable in the future. I'm quoting Mears when I suggest that this is quite a similar question to the one above, meaning that the key scholars and the range are likely to be similar. However, she does stress that you may want to consider in a bit more detail for this question the range of religious responses, and that religious scholars who may challenge this particular statement. Mears gives us the specific example of a religious argument that may challenge this statement, as some religious responses rely on a comprehension of God as a divine being. And she suggests that Augustine's view and the quotation from 1 Corinthians 13:12 could be used to make a case to support either view. To understand 1 Corinthians 13:12, I think the New Living Translation of the Bible provides us a good translation. It says, "Now we see things imperfectly." Think about this in terms of, will we ever account for the relationship between mind and body? "Now we see things imperfectly, like puzzling reflections in a mirror, but then we will see everything with perfect clarity." We might think about here the idea of John Hick and eschatological verification. We will see everything with perfect clarity. All that I know now is partial and incomplete, but then I will know everything completely, just as God knows me completely. Now we have a question that was asked in 2011. And that question is asking us to fully consider whether or not an understanding of the mind and body relationship is essential for understanding personal identity. And this is traditionally a problem area for students. Many make mistakes when talking about personal identity, so you should consider this as one that will be essential to revise, because if it comes up, there's a real opportunity for you, as other students tend to make mistakes and we can avoid those ourselves. So the weaker candidates couldn't really apply their material. Well, one good example of discussion for you might be to decide whether deciding whether to be a monist or dualist really matters to help us understand personal identity. You might discuss this in detail by thinking about something like a car crash or any life incident that could dramatically change somebody's physical appearances. And then we could ask whether a car crash and a physical change really affects their essence. And you might examine the monistic and dualistic perspective on an issue such as that. Now, besides key scholars and their views, you might also want to specify the religious interpretation on this, so you may refer to religious texts and scripture, such as, of course, the Bible, which references a soul in particular ways and talks about what it is that makes a person special in the eyes of God, and will provide an interesting response to this, of which you can give your own opinion to, especially in light of Darwin's views and the idea of evolution, and whether or not that provides a context for us to understand personal identity. And of course, if you've got information from psychology, you can apply this to this particular question. The final recommendation here is that you should conclude with a clear sentence or statement, a declaration that summarises your main points of your essay. Now, this is not repetition. You don't want to introduce anything new in a conclusion. You don't want to repeat. But what you should do is provide a point that summarises the argument you've already built up prior to this point in your essay, but replies very directly to the question. Therefore, it is or is not essential for understanding personal identity, for example. Going to abandon this exam question one more time as we look at the third category. Excuse me, I'm just being silly, moving it out of the way. I just want to show you that we're looking at different types of questions. We're looking at the third group now, which is where there's a range presented within the actual question itself. This is the group that Laura Mears identifies as a choice between all three: mind, personal identity, and the soul. She suggests that in the past there have been two particularly tricky questions that belong to this category. These two questions are: the mind is the brain and no more, which was asked in 2012, and in 2013 we were asked whether the mind is more than the brain. They're similar but present clearly similar challenges. The first thing is to recognise that where you are given a choice in this in these exam questions, because it says after the statement, it says examine these with reference to mind, personal identity, or the soul. The first thing to do is in your original thesis state which you will be examining. So be very clear about which concepts you choose to write about and stick firmly to that. Laura Mears argues that you may consider each in turn mind, personal identity and the soul, and what material you have prepared on this particular question, and deciding whether or not a combination of a certain two helps you. She says, for example, if you were explaining the anti-realist approach to terms used within religion, something that we'll study in religious language, then you might be able to explain that the meaning of certain terms used within religion makes sense to people within those spheres of thought, but perhaps do not to those outside of that sphere of thought. And if you were going to make that point, then you should talk about the views of Ludwig Wittgenstein. Okay, but to try to detract from some of the panic you might be experiencing with these questions, you should recognise that monism and dualism still represent the fundamental, crucial bits of information to be dealing with these questions, to be able to explain how a monist might interpret a statement or how a dualist might interpret a statement and why, and the main views, and exploring those views. And in doing that, it will still create the main bulk of your essay for a slightly more difficult question like this. You might refer to the monist Richard Dawkins, for example, and provide his quotation. There is no protoplasmic mystic jelly. We are just bytes and bytes of digital information, Dawkins says in River Out of Eden, and compare it to whether we are flesh animated by a soul, as J.A.T. Robinson says. It's recommended that if you're given a question like this, you centralise your arguments around the debate between monism and dualists, although where possible you will separate the terms into different branches in order to analyse through your essay. Now, to finish this presentation off, I'm going to give you a list of general recommendations with regards to how to write an A-grade philosophy essay, again taken from the useful resource. This time it's by Brian Poxon, How to Write Philosophy Essays. I'm going to try and discuss some skills and techniques that I'd call general essay recommendations, and I'm trying to keep it as simple as possible, but this might be something that you think about when you practice constructing and drafting your essays. The first thing to consider is how to critically analyse an argument, and you might think of it as having 3 stages. You first need to make the point you would like to make, like, for example, this feature of Descartes' argument is unsuccessful, and then remember to always explain why and provide a reason, and that means that your answer is becoming developed. However, in order to analyse, you should think about a microscope. Always use your microscope when you're analysing. And what this means is that you focus specifically on a particular point or feature within an argument rather than the whole of an argument at once. So rather than dualism, it's Descartes' dualism. Rather than Descartes' dualism, it's Descartes' argument that the mind is not an extended thing, for example. Or to give an easier example, rather than criticise Bentham's utilitarianism, you criticise his hedonic calculus. Rather than criticise the hedonic calculus, you criticise a feature of the hedonic calculus. So you might instead say that this specificity of the argument fails because, and provide an extended reason. The next recommendation is that you use link phrases to build your arguments. One way of assuring your argument is a controlled sequence is to use a link phrase. For example, here we need to consider the following objection, or having argued X, I now want to consider Y. Or some may object to this perspective as, or further support for this claim comes from. We need to think of essay structure, and in general, we like to aim for a 5-part essay structure, and they involve the following 5 steps. Number 1 is to carefully look at the question. Number 2 is establish your thesis in a good opening introduction. Number 3, work through careful analysis of the scholars and their arguments. That's where you complete this skill, careful analysis of scholars and arguments. Using your link phrases, you might say, further support comes from, or this is objected to by this particular scholar. And then section 4 is to consider and evaluate, and that should occupy a fairly extended part of your essay in order to get the 15 marks for AO2 available. Consider and evaluate counter-arguments would represent about a third of the length of your essay. And the final and fifth part of your essay structure is your conclusion. Conclude strongly, where you provide a summary statement with that really summarises the thrust of the argument as mentioned previously. The next step is to carefully evaluate ideas and provide philosophical judgment during your essay. What that means is that you need to evaluate strengths and weaknesses of individual arguments, placing various features of the arguments under a microscope where you criticise, spot flaws, identify the logic, and then compare with one another, or at various points comparing with one another rather, before you provide your own philosophical judgment. That means you are entitled to give a perspective on how the scholar responds to the main statement in the argument, the main purpose of your essay, and also how their argument survives in general. You can make criticisms over their logic, their evidence, their reasoning, their explanations, or even their context. You might, for example, say, as this scholar was prior to the invention of modern science and technology, for example, you find their argument is not particularly robust when compared with a modern scholar, that sort of thing. And that will count as critical comparison, leading to evaluation. I always focus on the value in evaluate, as in you are being handed a number of arguments and you must let the examiner know how highly you rate them or how much you value each individual argument. It's important to make sure that you know exactly what the difference is between an evaluation and an analysis. We like to think of analysis either by talking about something like a microscope or by thinking about breaking something into its smaller parts to gain a broader understanding. An evaluation provides a judgment, it can include opinion, and lets the reader know how highly you rate the contribution by the scholar, the scripture, or the view. All right, well, thank you for surviving this far. I'm just going to end with what the examiner will be really looking for in your essay. And we have 3 ideas here. The examiner is looking for relevance, that's of your selected material, and the appropriateness of the links from the material you've chosen to the question and the main thesis and argument you're constructing. You will need to ensure that the argument you're presenting is coherent, that your ideas make sense, and that the sentences and paragraphs link together and are fluent. And finally, that your argument has a high degree of clarity. Your style should be clear. You don't have to define every technical word, but if it does help with clarification, then always provide clarification. You can use brackets if you need to. Okay, that's it for my how to pass a Unit 2 philosophy paper, and I hope it's useful to you. Feel free to give me feedback. Thanks very much for listening.